Before starting, we're going to make sure that core is engaged, everything is nice and tight. We're going to bend over and pick up that kettlebell, get set, make sure there's lots of tension throughout the body. As we lower down into the squat, you want to make sure your knees are going outwards, tracking over the toes. We want to make sure there is no movement in the core. So the core is nice and engaged, glutes are engaged, upper body is nice and tight as well. There should be no shifting. It's just straight up and down into the squat. Kettlebell marches are going to be a core centered movement, so you want to make sure your core is nice and tight before you start. Then you're going to go ahead and press that kettlebell straight up next to your ear. With this exercise, you want to make sure you have minimal shifting in the hips as you pick each leg up. So you'll go nice and slow. If you feel any shifting, slow it down, take your time, keep that core as tight as possible. This is going to minimize the shifting. This exercise is also going to test your shoulder stability, so you want to make sure you're keeping that kettlebell and arm as close to your ear as possible as you continue with this exercise. Around the world, they're going to be a core center movement, so you want to make sure your core is nice and tight and you have a neutral pelvis so that there is no arch in your lower back. Then as you spin the kettlebell around your head, you want to make sure you have very minimal movement in the core. You want to make sure everything stays as still as possible. You are going to continue reps in one direction, and then once you hit your set amount of reps, you're going to go ahead and change directions and go the opposite way around your body. The Romanian deadlift is going to be a hip hinging movement. So with this one, you want to make sure your core is nice and tight, keeping a flat back from the top of your head down to the base of your spine near the pelvis. As you push your hips back, you want to make sure you're stretching the glutes and stretching the hamstrings. You should have a slight bend in the knees. Do not look up on this exercise. This will create a kink in the neck, putting more pressure on the lower back, which you do not want. All pressure should be in the glutes and hamstrings. The goblet squat, you want to make sure your feet are about shoulder width apart. Then you're going to go ahead and pick up that kettlebell. Anytime you have the weight in front of your body, it's going to really test your core. So make sure your core is nice and tight as you go down on each rep. Make sure your knees are not caving inward, tracking. You want to make sure the knees are tracking over the toes. And as you go down, you want to keep a flat back from the top of your head down to the bottom of your spine. Do not arch your lower back, as this is common when the core is not tight enough. You're going to start with your feet a little bit further than shoulder width apart, toes turned slightly outwards. Then you're going to go ahead and pick up the kettlebell, making sure you're driving with the legs, drive through the heels to really engage the glutes. Then as you go down on each rep, you want to make sure your knees are tracking over your toes. Do not allow your knees to cave in. You also want to make sure you're keeping the top of your head in line with the rest of your spine so you have a flat back. Do not look up on this exercise. This will create a kink in the neck and put more pressure on the lower back, which you do not want. Overhead walking lunge is going to test your core stability, your shoulder stability, and your balance. So as you do this exercise, you want to make sure your arms are right next to your ears. You want to make sure your core is nice and tight. And then as you lunge forward, making sure you're driving with the front leg. So all the work should be done by that front leg that's bent. You should be driving through your heel and squeezing that glute at the top of each rep. The kettlebell drag is going to be a core-centered movement. You're going to get down on the ground into a plank position with a wide stance. As you drag the kettlebell from one side to the other, you're going to keep your hips as still as possible. You want to make sure there is as little shifting as possible in the hips as you're dragging this kettlebell back and forth. This is going to require a lot of core strength.